In our lesson today, we are going to take two vectors and add them together. They may ask you the problem, like you see over here on the left, where they give you both of them in polar form. They tell you how long and in what direction. Or they may do it like this, the red vector plus the blue vector, and they may give them both to you with I hat and J hat, so they're in rectangular form. What we are trying to do when we add vectors is we start off, and one way or another, we go some direction, some distance. Then wherever we stopped there, we go some other direction, some other distance. Adding them together means where do we end up relative to the starting point. So instead of going the zigzag route, we are trying to find if we went directly to the end point, what would be the red vector that I just drew? How would we describe it? So steps for that. First thing, and for now I want you to draw each vector separately, and then we'll draw it together with the final result. But for right now, we're going to start off drawing them separately. Later on, we can just do the combined drawing after we've gotten a little bit of practice to make sure we understand what's going on. Regardless of whether they give it to you in polar or rectangular form, you can only add it if it's in I hat and J hat form. So it has to be in I hat, J hat form before you can add it. And again, that's what we call rectangular form. So if it's already in that form, you add it. If it's in polar form, how far, what angle, we had to change it. Then we add the I hats and we add the J hats. And we ask ourselves, based on the positives and negatives of I hat and J hat, what quadrant did we end up in? If I hat and J hat are both positive, positive to the left, positive up, we ended up in the first quadrant. If they're both negative, we ended up in the third quadrant, and so on. When, especially a little bit later, when we then try to do some other things with it, it's going to be important that we know what quadrant we're in. For today, we're just going to say, oh, we end up in the third quadrant, so we draw our final vector going into the third quadrant for that final step. So for now, we're going to have 3 sketches each time we do these. So let's jump in and try our first one. We are going to add 30 at 55 degrees. So first step is we need to draw that. That one's pretty easy because it's 55 degrees is first quadrant, so a little bit more than 45 degrees. And I'm going to say that's 30 long, and this is 55 degrees. We know that I hat and J hat are both positive in that quadrant. So if we wanted to, like we've been doing, just change 30 at 55 degrees to rectangular form, we would do positive. I wouldn't really need to write that because it's at the beginning. 30 for how long it is. Cosine, because it's the I hat, 55 degrees. And that would be our I hat part of our answer. And because it's first quadrant, the J hat is also positive. So we'd also have a positive 30. J hat uses the sine of the 55 degrees. And whatever the calculator would tell us, that would be the J hat part of the rectangular form. We do not enter those separately on our calculator. That's a waste of our time to try to enter those by themselves and write it down. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to write it like this on our papers. This is part of what we will put in the calculator in a moment. Then we do the same thing for the second vector, except it happens to be a little bit harder because it's not first quadrant. Everybody hold up fingers. First, second, third, or fourth quadrant, where am I going to draw 170 degrees? So I am mostly seeing 2 fingers up, which is correct. We go just a little bit short of the 180 degrees. So I'm going to be going like this into the second quadrant. Now my first one was 30. This one is only 10 long. So I don't have to be exact on the scale, but I want to kind of estimate it. It needs to be shorter than the third one. So maybe about a third as long. So maybe something about like that. So this is now 10 long. And I went 170 degrees from that positive x-axis. We only know right triangle trig. So if I'm going to start talking about sine and cosine, I have to have a right triangle. It is not possible to draw a right triangle that has another angle that's 170 degrees in it. So I am really thinking about this little triangle over here in the second quadrant. If I am in the second quadrant, I went left, so that was negative, up, so that was positive. And I have to use the 10 degrees that is in between the 170 and 180. So since this was second quadrant, the I hat, the cosine part needs to be negative. The J hat part, the sine needs to be positive. It's always how long it is, so 10. I hat gets the cosine part, J hat gets the sine part. And our reference angle is 10 degrees. And it's just a coincidence that I happen to have a 10 in front and a 10 for the angle. Most of the time, it's more like the green one where it's two different numbers. Now what I need the class to do is to enter 30 cosine 55 minus 10 cosine 10 degrees on your calculator, and enter 30 sine 55 degrees plus 10 sine 10 degrees on your calculator. And then you are going to tell me what you get for those two numbers. And those will be our I hat and our J hat for our final answer. And was that positive or negative? So we got the positive 7.359 for the I hat. We have to be sure we write that in. What do we have for the J hat one? Leah, did you get that one? And was that a positive or a negative? Don't forget the plus sign in between. Thumbs up, is that what everybody's getting? Okay, now notice that was positive, that was positive. That means we ended up in the first quadrant. Let's see if we can make sense out of that on our picture. If I drew these end to end, so here's the first one that is 30 long. Here is the second one that is only 10 long. Does it make sense to you that I am ending up in the first quadrant? Does it make sense 7 to the right, 26 up, farther up? Is that what my vector looks like? Does it make sense? So you have now added correctly those two vectors. Question? Okay, I'll take a look at your calculator individually when we're done. Does it say degrees up in the top right corner, or does it say RAD? Go up, click it, and that'll toggle it, and now it'll be degrees, and then if you redo them, you'll get these numbers. That's a different way of measuring angles. Okay, let's try a word problem, and this is what he was talking about when he stepped in a moment ago. So we've got Tracker leaving the cabin. So the cabin's going to be our starting point. And he's going to go 20 degrees, that's first quadrant, and we're going to go 25 miles into the first quadrant. So that is something maybe about like that, where that is 25 long, and our angle is 20 degrees. This is an easy one. First quadrant is plus plus, so positive 25 cosine 20 degrees for the I hat part, and positive 25 sine 20 degrees for the J hat part. Thumbs up, thumbs down. So far, so good with that part. Okay, from that point, she's going to turn and go a different direction. From that point, she's now going to go 50 miles, so even farther, but at 215 degrees. Quadrants, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Hold up your fingers, 215. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where will we be? Seeing fingers up for 3, we will indeed be down here in Q3 for this one. 180 degrees would have taken us around to here. We need to go about 35 degrees past that and about twice as far. So far, so good. Q3, going to the left is negative, going down is negative. So negative, negative in Q3. So that means negative for the cosine part and negative for the sine part. Distance, how long it is, goes on the outside. And the angle has to be that 35 degrees. Now, before you enter these on your calculator, I want to show you something because we're going to do another little step with it that we haven't done before. So be sure you've got those formulas written down on your paper so you know what to enter on your calculator when I have my calculator screen up here. So let's all grab our calculators and let's enter the first one, 25 cosine 20 degrees. Be sure we remember to go outside that parentheses, and then minus the 50 cosine, and this time it's 35 degrees. And hopefully you are seeing a negative 17.465. Before you do anything else, I want you to tell the calculator to remember this number without rounding. Remember all of the digits in it. So to do that, we're going to do Control, and then if you hit the variable button right up above it, it says STO for store. And since that is going to be my I hat with the cosines, I am going to save it as I. So I'm saying, calculator, remember all of these digits of what I just got for I, and then push enter. Now enter the second one, but this one we're going to store as J because that's going to tell us what J hat is. Oops, I have this written down incorrectly up on the board. I wrote cosine right here. It should have been sine. I'm realizing that now that I'm typing it in. Be sure you're doing sine for both of the J hat parts. And be sure you've corrected this in your notes for your reference. Abby, did yours work okay for the I hat this time with that change? And what do we have, Cooper, for the J hat part? What'd you get? I just haven't punched enter on my calculator yet. What'd you get? Others, negative 20.128. So I'm going to do enter. I got the same thing, and now I'm going to store mine as J. And then I'm going back to the problem for a moment. So what we have just done is we have figured out that our answer, both of these were negatives, 17.465 I hat minus 20.128 J hat. Negative, negative is what quadrant? It's third quadrant. So what we've said is if we did this first arrow and ended up at this blue dot, and then we went at a little bit slightly steeper angle, but in the opposite direction and went more than twice as far, that our final answer, if we had started at the origin, we really ended up somewhere in the third quadrant. Does that make sense on my picture? Now, what we have answered is, where did she end up? We have not yet answered how far away from the cabin did she end up. So this is why we stored it on this one. This was our I hat, this was our j hat. So Pythagorean theorem, I hat squared plus j hat squared is that distance squared or that r squared. So what we are looking for is how long is the red vector, and it's going to be the square root of the I hat squared plus the j hat squared. I don't care that those are negatives. When I square them, I'm going to get positives. So now on my calculator, here's how I enter that. I enter it just basically like that, except without the hats. I do control and then my square root symbol. And then inside of it, I type the I, because I told the calculator, remember all of the digits without rounding on I, square that, plus the J, and square that. And are we getting 26.649? And our units were miles from the cabin. Yes. I'll take a look for individual calculator things in just a moment. But in general, any questions about what we've covered today? Then that wraps up our lesson.